Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting mushrooms. This time I've chosen to paint very long and lanky umbrella looking mushrooms, so let's begin by sketching it out. Like usual, I want to sketch very lightly and loosely just to map out the composition. I've chosen to simplify the mushroom caps by drawing rounded triangles in different widths. And as for the stems, I just drew out lines which are kind of wavy so I can visualize how these wavy lines will interact with each other. I like to play around with the growth stages. For most of the mushrooms, I make the caps more or less the same, but I want to add one which is very open for a slight contrast with the rest of the mushrooms. After I've painted the main mushrooms in the middle, I just add on more mushrooms to fill in the rest of the composition to frame the ones in the middle. After that, I want to start thickening the stems. I find it much easier to draw on the lines either side of the main line that I drew out earlier. This way the stems will remain positioned at the center of each of the mushroom caps. Next, I'm going to add more details to the line of the mushroom caps. I want the bottom edge to be a bit frilly and uneven, and for some, I also want to add little rips since these mushrooms are very delicate. And to add a bit of variation, I also want to show the inside of the mushroom caps for some of them. At the moment, the mushrooms are all separated, so to combine them all together, I'm going to add a bit of soil with moss and some leaves at the bottom of these mushrooms. I also decided to add one additional mushroom on the side since there's a bit of space, and as for the leaves, I try to not add too much because I don't want to take the attention away from the mushrooms. As for the colors, I'm going to be using Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Ochre Green by Cotman, Sepia by Holbein, and Permanent Green by Holbein. I'm also going to be using some colored pencils to create the outlines. You can also use a pen if you would like to. As for the colored pencils, these are the colors I'll be using. This is just from a cheap Faber Castell hobby grade watercolor colored pencils, which doesn't have names for the colors, instead they have numbers. So here are the colors that I'll be using. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I'll be painting on damaged paper, and it's really difficult to get the watercolor even if I were to paint a large space for the background, so I'll be using my Himi gouache instead, and the colors are yellow-green, earth yellow, and white. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to start with the base underneath the mushrooms as well as the greeneries. I started with a mix of permanent green and yellow ochre to create a yellow-green, and I'm going to use this color to paint some grass in a medium consistency by creating wavy lines directed at different angles, and then taking off the pressure as I get to the tip of the grass to create a thinner weight for the lines. As for the leaves behind the mushrooms, I'm going to create a different tone of green by adding hooker's green to the previous yellow-green mixture. And I'm just going to paint on the base color, spreading the color around the leaves that I've already drawn out. To make the composition a bit more dynamic, I like to weave the leaves around, so some leaves might be behind the stem of the mushrooms and some are in front. As for the moss, I'm just going to use the same green on my palette, but I am using a slightly lighter consistency, and as I'm spreading the paint, I like to wiggle my brush around and play with the pressure of my brush to create an even texture. After that, I want to add a darker value, so I added more hooker's green, and I'm going to apply this to the sides of the moss that I've already painted earlier. For the base of the soil, I'm going to start by using a mix of sepia and yellow ochre. I'm just placing this in some areas and leaving out a bit of white negative space for the lighter as well as the darker values. I then add a bit more sepia into the mix for a darker value, and I'm going to place this in the white areas that I've left out. I'm not worried if I left out some small white negative space though, I just find that this adds to the texture anyway. After painting on the base color for the soil, I decided to go over the moss areas again by adding a bit of yellow ochre to the previous green that I already had on my palette. I just found that the initial green was a bit too cold in temperature, so I decided to warm it up with the yellow ochre and turn this to be more of an earthy green. After that, I'm going to layer on a bit more detail to the soil or the rocky area. I'm not sure what texture I was making, but I just added sepia into the previous mixture of the brown that I already had on my palette, and I paint on lines to create this kind of rough textured surface. Next, I'm going to add the darker values for the grass. I just added sepia to the greens that I already had on my palette. I like to add this darker value for the bottom part of each of the grass, and I'm also going to use this to separate some overlapping areas. Now let's move on to the mushrooms. I'm going to start by painting the stems. Just like the soil before, I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and sepia, but this time I'm using a light consistency, and this mixture also has a bit more yellow ochre in the ratio. And after painting it on thinly while the surface is still damp, I'm going to dot in the same color with a slightly thicker consistency in random areas. So there are changes in the value of the stems to give this painting a bit more interest. I'm going to do this slightly though, since I want to make sure that the colors will be balanced with the rest of the mushrooms, so I have room to layer on more colors if I feel the need to after painting on the caps. The reason why I'm painting this one last is because it's in front of two other mushrooms, so I want this stem to be lighter than the ones behind. Next, I'm going to paint the inside of the mushroom caps. For this, I'm just going to use sepia in a medium to even, almost thick consistency. And I'm just going to paint this evenly in the flat color. Don't forget to avoid the area for the stem though. Once I'm done, I'm going to paint on the caps. For this, I start out by using sepia in a very thin consistency for the bottom, and as I move on upwards, I'm going to use a little bit of yellow ochre, and at the very tip, I'm going to use Quin Sienna. As you can see, my colors aren't blending that well. That's because the paper is damaged, so you won't have this problem of blending the color as much. And by the way, for the tip of the mushroom, I like to use a very saturated color, so I try to use a thicker consistency of the Quin Sienna. In terms of the placement for these three colors, is completely up to you. You can make the Quin Sienna be the dominant color or any of the other colors. You can just play around with this and differentiate it for all the mushrooms. As you can see, for the one on the left, I ended up using more sepia on top of the mushrooms, and that's okay as well. And you can also keep layering on the colors until you're satisfied with the saturation and the value of the colors. Once the base color of these mushrooms are dry, I went back in with sepia to paint on the frills, which essentially is the color of the inside of the caps peeking through the rib parts of the cap. What I essentially want to do with the color is for the bottom of the mushroom caps to be much lighter, and as it progresses to the top, I want the colors to be stronger and also a little bit darker. As I mentioned before, you can play around with the placement of the yellow ochre, Quin Sienna, and sepia, and also play around with the saturation when it comes to the top part of those mushroom caps, so the colors there can pop out a little bit more. After painting on the first layer for the caps, I'm going to use a bit of sepia to layer on the inside of the caps, and I'm layering on the darker value for the deeper parts of the caps, so the inside is slightly darker than the outer part of the inner cap. Here I'm going back to layer on more colors to make them a bit more saturated, since the first layer is completely dry and of course the colors faded. Because I am painting on damaged paper, it is really hard for me to bring out the saturation since most of the colors just seeps into the paper. So for your case, you can keep layering until you're happy with the saturation, but as for me, I'm just going to help bring out the saturation and details by using my colored pencils. The colors that I've chosen for my pencils are actually very similar to the colors of the mushroom caps, so I'm just going to alternate accordingly, but don't let this stop you from playing around with different colors. If you feel like certain colors are not popping out enough and you want to use a darker color instead, that's also okay. So for me, I like using the darkest browns for the bottom to extend the textures that I've already painted for the rips, and the pencil also helps to create the lines for the frills since they're very fine. But for the top section, I might use the burnt sienna colored pencil and the yellow ochre instead for those areas. And to soften the pencil marks, sometimes I like to also brush a bit of clean water to smudge it all together. You can also add additional textures and imperfections to the mushroom caps if you'd like to add more interest. For parts of the very open cap where the frills have bigger openings, I like to add the darker values on the lower areas, so the higher openings can be lighter in value to help with the three-dimensional form. And yeah, I'm just going to continue to do this for the rest of the mushrooms. Next, I'm going to outline the stems, and I'm just using the darkest brown color, and I'm not really going to add too much textures or anything like that since the stems are already very thin. After adding on the outline as well as the details of the mushroom caps, I feel like the stems are looking kind of pale now, so I'm going to add a bit more color, but instead of using my watercolors, I'm just going to use my pencil, and then I'm just going to add water to it to turn it into watercolors. This way it's much easier to control where I want those colors to be placed. After that, I'm pretty much done with the mushrooms, and I want to add the details for the leaves. For this, I'm using a dark green. I made sure my pencil is nice and sharp, and I'm going to use it to paint the midribs as well as the veins. Since the grass is fairly light, I'm going to use the dark green to outline the edges. Next, for the soil or whatever surface these mushrooms are supposed to be on, I added etchings to the darkest parts with my dark brown pencil. I find that the extra texture really brings the composition together, and after that, I'm actually done. But before we finish off, I'm going to add one final thing, which is the background. I decided to use an off-white color for my background from a mix of white with a tiny bit of yellow ochre and even less yellow-green. I just find that the white of the paper as the background is a bit too harsh, but you can actually play with brighter, more fun colors as well for the background, like any pastel hues would work. This would give more of an illustrative feel, or you can also use darker colors like a dark green or dark brown to make the composition look more realistic and mysterious. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using my gouache because it's thicker in consistency, which means that the colors won't seep into my damaged paper, but I also find that using gouache makes it much easier to create a flatter color for the background. So if you want to add a background to your painting, you can pick the medium of your choice. For my painting, I want this to have more of a fun illustrative feel, so I'm going to create a frame for the background and I'm just going to round the edges. By the way, I'll also have the outline of these mushrooms available in my coffee shop in case any of you want to jump straight into painting. After I'm done with the background, I decided to give it one final look to balance everything out. I decided to add a bit more textures to certain areas like the mushroom caps. I also ended up outlining parts of the grass using my darkest brown. As for the stems, I'm going to make quite a bit of adjustments here because I feel like the light colors of the stem is fighting against the off-white background, so I need to increase the contrast of the colors. I'm going to use my yellow ochre colored pencils to add more saturation to most of these stems, and for the overlapping areas I decided to add some of the darker browns, and I used water to blend the colors together. And that's it for the tutorial. I just love painting mushrooms. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more content by me, please don't forget to subscribe. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!